sitting there and moralizing on the fact that no matter which course he chose, the result would be that that design and plan to which he had given 50 years of his life had just as well never have existed at all by almost exactly 50 years. And Grandfather not knowing what choice he was talking about even, what second choice he was faced with until the very last word he spoke before he got up and put on his hat and shook Grandfather's left hand and rode away. This second choice, need to choose, as obscure to Grandfather as the reason for the first, the repudiation, had been. So that Grandfather did not even say, "I don't know which you should choose." Not because that was all he could have said, and so to say that would be less than no answer at all, but that anything he might have said would have been less than no answer at all, since Sutton was not listening, did not expect an answer, who had not come for pity, and there was no advice that he could have taken, and justification he had already coerced from his conscience 30 years ago. And he still knew that he had courage, and though he may have come to doubt lately that he had acquired that shrewdness which at one time he believed he had, he still believed that it existed somewhere in the world to be learned, and that if it could be learned, he would yet learn it. And maybe even this, Grandfather said. If shrewdness could not extricate him this second time as it had before, he could at least depend on the courage to find him will and strength to make a third start toward that design as it had found him to make the second with, who came into the office not for pity and not for help, because Grandfather said he had never learned how to ask anybody for help or anything else, and so would not have known what to do with the help if Grandfather could have given it to him, but came just with that sober and quiet bemusement, hoping maybe, if he hoped at all, if he were doing anything but just thinking out loud at all, that the legal mind might perceive and clarify that initial mistake which he still insisted on, which he himself had not been able to find. I was faced with condoning a fact which had been foisted upon me without my knowledge during the process of building toward my design, which meant the absolute and irrevocable negation of the design, or in holding to my original plan for the design in pursuit of which I had incurred this negation. I chose, and I made to the fullest what atonement lay in my power for whatever injury I might have done in choosing, paying even more for the privilege of choosing as I chose than I might have been expected to, or even by law required. Yet I am now faced with a second necessity to choose, the curious factor of which is not, as you pointed out and as first appeared to me, that the necessity for a new choice should have arisen, but that either choice which I might make, either course which I might choose, leads to the same result. Either I destroy my design with my own hand, which will happen if I am forced to play my last trump card, or do nothing, let matters take the course which I know they will take, and see my design complete itself quite normally and naturally and successfully to the public eye, yet to my own in such fashion as to be a mockery and a betrayal of that little boy who approached that door 50 years ago and was turned away, for whose vindication the whole plan was conceived and carried forward to the moment of this choice, this second choice, devolving out of that first one, which in its turn was forced on me as the result of an agreement, an arrangement which I entered in good faith, concealing nothing, while the other party or parties to it concealed from me the one very factor which would destroy the entire plan and design which I had been working toward, concealed it so well that it was not until after the child was born that I discovered that this factor existed. Your old man, Shreve said, when your grandfather was telling this to him, he didn't know any more what your grandfather was talking about than your grandfather knew what the demon was talking about when the demon told it to him, did he? And when your old man told it to you, you wouldn't have known what anybody was talking about if you hadn't been out there and seen Clytie. Is that right? Yes, Quentin said. Grandfather was the only friend he had. The demon had? Quentin didn't answer, didn't move. It was cold in the room now. The heat was almost gone out of the radiators. The cold iron, fluting stern signal and admonition for sleeping, the little death, the renewal. It had been some time now since the chimes had rung 11. All right, Shreve said. He was hugging himself into the bathrobe now as he had formerly hugged himself inside his pink, naked, almost hairless skin. He chose. He chose lechery. So do I. But go on. His remark was not intended for flippancy, nor even derogation. It was born, if from any source, of that incorrigible, unsentimental sentimentality of the young, which takes the form of hard and often crass levity, to which, by the way, Quentin paid no attention whatever, resuming as if he had never been interrupted, his face still lowered, still brooding apparently on the open letter upon the open book between his hands. He left for Virginia that night. Grandfather said how he went to the window and watched him ride across the square on the gaunt black stallion, erect in his faded gray, the hat with its broken plume cocked a little, yet not quite so much as the beaver of the old days, as if, Grandfather said, even with his martial rank and prerogatives, he did not quite swagger like he used to do. Not because he was chastened by misfortune, or spent, or even war-wearied, but as though even while riding he was still bemused in that state in which he struggled to hold clear and free above a maelstrom of unpredictable and unreasoning human beings, not his head for breath, and not so much his 50 years of effort and striving to establish a posterity, but his code of logic and morality, his formula and recipe of fact and deduction, whose balanced sum and product declined, refused to swim or even float, saw him approach the Holston house, and saw old Mr. McCaslin and 2 other old men hobble out and stop him, he sitting the stallion and talking to them, and his voice not raised, Grandfather said, yet the very sober quality of his gestures and the set of his shoulders forensic, oratorical. Then he went on. He could still reach Sutpin's 100 before dark, so it was probably after supper that he headed the stallion toward the Atlantic Ocean, he and Judith facing one another again for maybe a full minute, he not needing to say, "I will stop it if I can," she not needing to say, "Stop it then, if you can," but just goodbye, the kiss on the brow and no tears, a word to Clytie and to Wash, master to slave, baron to retainer. "Well, Clytie, take care of Miss Judith. Wash, I'll send you a piece of Abe Lincoln's coat tail from Washington." And I reckon Wash answering like it used to be under the scuppernongs with the demijohn and the well bucket, "Sho, Colonel, kill every one of the varmints." So he ate the hoe cake and drank the parched acorn coffee and rode away. Then it was 65, and the army, Grandfather had gone back to it too. He was a brigadier now, though I reckon this was for more reason than because he just had one arm, had retreated across Georgia and into Carolina, and they all knew it wouldn't be very much longer now. Then one day Lee sent Johnston some reinforcements from one of his corps, and Grandfather found out that the 23rd Mississippi was one of the regiments. And he, Grandfather, didn't know what had happened, whether Sutpin had found out in some way that Henry had at last coerced his conscience into agreeing with him, as his, Henry's, father had done 30 years ago, whether Judith perhaps had written her father that she had heard from Bon at last, and what she and Bon intended to do, or if the 4 of them had just reached as one person that point where something had to be done, had to happen. He, Grandfather, didn't know. He just learned one morning that Sutpin had ridden up to Grandfather's old regiment's headquarters and asked and received permission to speak to Henry, and did speak to him, and then rode away again before midnight. "So he got his choice made after all," Shreve said. "He played that trump after all. And so he came home and found—" "Wait," Quentin said. "What he must have wanted to find, or anyway what he was going to find." "Wait, I tell you," Quentin said, though still he did not move, nor even raise his voice, that voice with its tense, suffused, restrained quality. "I am telling." Am I going to have to hear it all again, he thought. I am going to have to hear it all over again. I am already hearing it all over again. I am listening to it all over again. I shall have to never listen to anything else but this again forever. So apparently, not only a man never outlives his father, but not even his friends and acquaintances do. That at least regarding which he should have needed no word nor warning, even if Judith would have sent him one, sent him acknowledgment that she was beaten, who, according to Mr. Compson, would no more have sent him acknowledgment that he had beat her, than she waited, who Miss Coldfield said was not bereaved, and met him on his return, not with the fury and despair, perhaps, which he might have expected, even though, knowing as little, having learned as little about women as Mr. Compson said he had, yet certainly with something other than the icy calm with which, according to Miss Coldfield, she met him, the kiss again after almost 2 years on the brow, the voices, the speeches, quiet, contained, almost impersonal, and, yes, Henry killed him, followed by the brief tears which ceased on the instant when they began, as if the moisture consisted of a single sheet or layer, thin as a cigarette paper, and in the shape of a human face. The, "Ah, Clytie, ah, Rosa." Well, Wash, I was unable to penetrate far enough behind the Yankee lines to cut a piece from that coat-tail, as I promised you. The, from Jones' guffaw, the chortle, the old imbecile stability of the articulated mud, which, Mr. Compson said, outlasts the victories and the defeats both. "Well, Colonel, they kilt us, but they ain't whipped us yet, air they?" And that was all. He had returned. He was home again, where his problem now was haste, passing time, the need to hurry. He was not concerned, Mr. Compson said, about the courage and the will, nor even about the shrewdness now. He was not for one moment concerned about his ability to start the third time. All that he was concerned about was the possibility that he might not have time sufficient to do it in, regain his lost ground in. He did not waste any of what time he had either. The will and the shrewdness, too, he did not waste, though he doubtless did not consider it to have been either his will or his shrewdness which supplied waiting to his hand the opportunity, and it was probably less of shrewdness and more of courage than even will which got him engaged to Miss Rosa within a period of 3 months, and almost before she was aware of the fact. Miss Rosa, the chief disciple and advocate of that cult of demon-harrying of which he was the chief object, even though not victim, engaged to him before she had got accustomed to having him in the house. Yes, more of courage than even will, yet something of shrewdness, too, the shrewdness acquired in excruciating driblets through the 50 years, suddenly capitulant and retroactive, or suddenly sprouting and flowering like a seed lain fallow in a vacuum or in a single iron clod, because he seemed to perceive without stopping in that passage through the house, which was an unbroken continuation of the long journey from Virginia, the pause not to greet his family, but merely to pick up Jones and drag him on out to the briar-choked fields and fallen fences and clap axe or mattock into his hands, the one weak spot, the one spot vulnerable to assault in Miss Rosa's embattled spinsterhood, and to assault and carry this in one stride with something of the ruthless tactical skill of his old master. The 23rd Mississippi was in Jackson's corps at one time, and then the shrewdness failed him again. It broke down. It vanished into that old impotent logic and morality which had betrayed him before. And what day might it have been? What furrow might he have stopped dead in, 1 foot advanced, the unsentient plow handles in his instantaneous, unsentient hands? What fence panel held in mid-air as though it had no weight by muscles which could not feel it, when he realized that there was more in his problem than just lack of time, that the problem contained some super-distillation of this lack, that he was now past 60, and that possibly he could get but one more son, had at best but one more son in his loins, as the old cannon might know when it is just one more shot in its corporeality. So he suggested what he suggested to her, and she did what he should have known she would do, and would have known probably, if he had not bogged himself again in his morality, which had all the parts but which refused to run, to move. Hence the proposal, the outrage and unbelief, the tide, the blast of indignation and anger upon which Miss Rosa vanished from Sutpin's 100, her air-ballooned skirts spread upon the flood, ship-light, her bonnet, possibly one of Ellen's, which she had prowled out of the attic, clapped fast onto her head, rigid and precarious with rage, and he standing there with the reins over his arm, with perhaps something like smiling inside his beard and about the eyes, which was not smiling, but the crinkled concentration of furious thinking. The haste, the need for it, the urgency, but not fear, not concern, just the fact that he had missed that time, though luckily it was just a spotting shot with a light charge, and the old gun, the old barrel and carriage none the worse. Only next time there might not be enough powder for both a spotting shot and then a full-sized load. The fact that the thread of shrewdness and courage and will ran onto the same spool which the thread of his remaining days ran onto, and that spool almost near enough for him to reach out his hand and touch it. But this was no grave concern yet, since it, the old logic, the old morality which had never yet failed to fail him, was already falling into pattern, already showing him conclusively that he had been right, just as he knew he had been, and therefore what had happened was just a delusion and did not actually exist.
"No," Shreve said, "you wait. Let me play a while. Now, Wash. Him, the demon, standing there with the horse, the saddled charger, the sheathed saber, the gray, waiting to be laid peaceful away among the moths and all lost save dishonor. Then the voice of the faithful gravedigger who opened the play and would close it, coming out of the wings like Shakespeare's very self. Well, Colonel, they mout have whopped us, but they ain't kilt us yet, air they?"
This was not flippancy either. It, too, was just that protective coloring of levity behind which the youthful shame of being moved hid itself, out of which Quentin also spoke, the reason for Quentin's sullen bemusement, the, on both their parts, flipness, the strained clowning, the two of them, whether they knew it or not, in the cold room, it was quite cold now, dedicated to that best of ratiocination which, after all, was a good deal like Sutpin's morality and Miss Coldfield's demonizing. This room not only dedicated to it, but set aside for it, and suitably so, since it would be here, above any other place, that it, the logic and the morality, could do the least amount of harm. The two of them back to back, as though at the last ditch saying no to Quentin's Mississippi shade, who in life had acted and reacted to the minimum of logic and morality, who dying had escaped it completely, who dead remained not only indifferent but impervious to it, somehow 1,000 times more potent and alive. There was no harm intended by Shreve, and no harm taken, since Quentin did not even stop. He did not even falter, taking Shreve up in stride, without comma or colon or paragraph. No reserve to risk a spotting shot with now. So he started this one like you start a rabbit out of a briar patch, with a little chunk of dried mud thrown by hand. Maybe it was the first string of beads out of his and Wash's little store, where he would get mad at his customers, the niggers and the trash and the haggling, and turn them out and lock the door and drink himself blind. And maybe Wash delivered the beads himself, Father said. That was down at the gate when he rode back from the war that day, that after he went away with the regiment would tell folks that he, Wash, was looking after Colonel's place and niggers until after a while maybe he even believed it. Father's mother said how when the Sutpin niggers first heard about what he was saying, they would stop him in the road that came up out of the bottom where the old fishing camp was that Sutpin let him and the granddaughter, she was about 8 then, live in. There would be too many of them for him to whip them all, to even try to, risk trying to. And they would ask him why he wasn't at the war, and he would say, "Get out in my road, niggers." And then it would be the outright laughing. asking one another, except it was not one another but him, who him, calling us niggers? And he would rush at them with a stick, and them avoiding him just enough, not mad at all, just laughing. And he was still carrying fish and animals he killed, or maybe stole, and vegetables up to the house, when that was about all Mrs. Sutpen and Judith and Clytie, too, had to live on. And Clytie would not even let him come into the kitchen with the basket even, saying, "Stop right there, white man. Stop right where you is. You ain't never crossed this door while Colonel was here, and you ain't going to cross it now." Which was true. Only Father said there was a kind of pride in it, that he had never tried to enter the house, even though he believed that if he had tried, Sutpen would not have let them repulse him. Like Father said, he might have said to himself, "The reason I won't try it ain't that I refuse to give any black nigger the chance to tell me I can't, but because I ain't going to force Mr. Tom to have to cuss a nigger or take a cussin' from his wife on my account." But they would drink together under the scuppernong arbor on the Sunday afternoons, and on the weekdays he would see Sutpen, the fine figure of the man, as he called it, on the black stallion, galloping about the plantation. And Father said how for that moment Wash's heart would be quiet and proud both, and that maybe it would seem to him that this world where niggers, that the Bible said had been created and cursed by God to be brute and vassal to all men of white skin, were better found and housed and even clothed than he and his granddaughter. That this world where he walked always in mocking and jeering echoes of nigger laughter was just a dream and an illusion, and that the actual world was the one where his own lonely apotheosis, Father said, galloped on the black thoroughbred, thinking maybe, Father said, how the book said that all men were created in the image of God, and so all men were the same in God's eyes anyway, looked the same to God at least. And so he would look at Sutpen and think, "Fine, proud man. If God himself was to come down and ride the natural earth, that's what he would aim to look like." Maybe he even delivered the first string of beads himself, and Father said maybe each of the ribbons afterward during the next 3 years, while the girl matured fast, like girls of that kind do. Or anyway, he would know and recognize each and every ribbon when he saw it on her, even when she lied to him about where and how she got it, which she probably did not, since she would be bound to know that he had been seeing the ribbons in the showcase every day for 3 years, and would have known them as well as he knew his own shoes. And not only he knew them, but all the other men, the customers and the loungers, the white and the black, that would be sitting and squatting about the store's gallery to watch her pass, not quite defiant and not quite cringing, and not quite flaunting the ribbons and the beads, but almost. Not quite any of them, but a little of all, bold, sullen, and fearful. But Father said how Wash's heart was probably still quiet, even after he saw the dress and spoke about it, probably only a little grave now, and watching her secret, defiant, frightened face, while she told him, before he had asked, maybe too insistent, too quick to volunteer it, that Miss Judith had given it to her, helped her to make it. And Father said maybe he realized all of a sudden, and without warning, that when he passed the men on the gallery, they would look after him, too, and that they already knew that which he had just thought they were probably thinking. But Father said his heart was still quiet, even now, and that he answered, if he answered at all, stopped the protestations and disclaimers at all. "Sure now, if Colonel and Miss Judith wanted to give it to you, I hope you minded to thank them." Not alarmed, Father said, just thoughtful, just grave. And Father said how that afternoon Grandfather rode out to see Sutpen about something, and there was nobody in the front of the store, and he was about to go out and go up to the house when he heard the voices from the back, and he walked on toward them, and so he overheard them before he could begin to not listen, and before he could make them hear him calling Sutpen's name. Grandfather couldn't see them yet. He hadn't even got to where they could hear him yet, but he said he knew exactly how they would be. Sutpen having already told Wash to get the jug out, and then Wash spoke, and Sutpen beginning to turn, realizing that Wash wasn't getting the jug, before he comprehended the import of what Wash was saying. Then, comprehending that, and still half turned, and then all of a sudden kind of reared back and flinging his head up, looking at Wash, and Wash standing there, not cringing either, in that attitude dogged and quiet and not cringing, and Sutpen said, "What about the dress?" And Grandfather said it was Sutpen's voice that was short and sharp, not Wash's, that Wash's voice was just flat and quiet, not abject, just patient and slow. "I have knowed you for going on 20 years now. I ain't never denied yet to do what you told me to do, and I'm a man past 60, and she ain't nothing but a 15-year-old gal." And Sutpen said, "Meaning that I'd harmed the girl? I, a man as old as you are?" And Wash, "If you was e'er a other man, I'd say you was as old as me. And old or no old, I wouldn't let her keep that dress nor nothing else that come from your hand. But you're different." And Sutpen said, "How different?" And Grandfather said how Wash did not answer, and that he called again now, and neither of them heard him. And then Sutpen said, "So that's why you are afraid of me." And Wash said, "I ain't afraid, because you are brave. It ain't that you were a brave man at 1 second or minute or hour of your life and got a paper to show it from General Lee. But you are brave, the same as you are alive and breathing. That's where it's different. It don't need no ticket from nobody to tell me that. And I know that whatever your hands touch, whether it's a regiment of men or a ignorant gal or just a hound dog, that you will make it right." Then Grandfather heard Sutpen move, sudden and sharp, and Grandfather said he thought about what he imagined Wash was thinking, but all Sutpen said was, "Get the jug." "Sure, Colonel," Wash said. So that Sunday came, a year after that day, and 3 years after he had suggested to Miss Rosa that they try it first, and if it was a boy and lived, they would be married. It was before daylight, and he was expecting his mare to foal to the black stallion, so when he left the house before day that morning, Judith thought he was going to the stable. Who knew what and how much about her father and Wash's granddaughter, nobody knew. How much she could not have helped but know from what Clytie must have known, may have or may not have told her whether or no, since everybody else, white or black in the neighborhood, knew who had ever seen the girl pass in the ribbons and beads which they all recognized, and how much she may have refused to discover during the fitting and sewing of that dress. Father said Judith actually did this. This was no lie that the girl told Wash. The two of them alone all day long for about a week in the house. And what they must have talked about, what Judith must have talked about, while the girl stood around in what she possessed to call underclothes, with her sullen, defiant, secret, watchful face, answering what, telling what that Judith may or may not have tried to shut her eyes to, nobody knew. So it was not until he failed to return at dinner time that she went or sent Clytie to the stable and found that the mare had foaled in the night, but that her father was not there. And it was not until mid-afternoon that she found a half-grown boy and paid him a nickel to go down to the old fish camp and ask Wash where Sutpen was. And the boy walked whistling around the corner of the rotting cabin and saw maybe the scythe first, maybe the body first, lying in the weeds, which Wash had not yet cut. And as he screamed, he looked up and saw Wash in the window, watching him. Then about a week later, they caught the nigger, the midwife, and she told how she didn't know that Wash was there at all that dawn when she heard the horse, and then Sutpen's feet, and he came in and stood over the pallet where the girl and the baby were, and said, "Penelope," that was the mare, "foaled this morning. A damn fine colt, going to be the spitting image of his daddy when I rode him north in '61. Do you remember?" And the old nigger, she said, "Yes, master," and that he jerked the riding whip toward the pallet and said, "Well, damn your black hide, horse or mare?" And that she told him, and that he stood there for a minute, and he didn't move at all, with the riding whip against his leg, and the lattices of sunlight from the unchinked wall falling upon him, across his white hair and his beard that hadn't turned at all yet. And she said she saw his eyes, and then his teeth inside his beard, and that she would have run then, only she couldn't couldn't seem to make her legs bear to get up and run. And then he looked at the girl on the pallet again and said, "Well, Millie, too bad you're not a mare, too. Then I could give you a decent stall in the stable," and turned and went out. Only she could not move even yet, and she didn't even know that Wash was outside there. She just heard Sutpin say, "Stand back, Wash! Don't you touch me!" And then Wash, his voice soft and hardly loud enough to reach her, "I'm going to touch you, Colonel." And Sutpin again, "Stand back, Wash!" sharp now. And then she heard the whip on Wash's face, but she didn't know if she heard the scythe or not, because now she found that she could move, get up, run out of the cabin and into the weeds, running.
"Wait," Shreve said, "wait. You mean that he had got to the son at last that he wanted, yet still he—"
Walked the 3 miles and back before midnight to fetch the old nigger, then sat on the sagging gallery until daylight came, and the granddaughter stopped screaming inside the cabin, and he even heard the baby once, waiting for Sutpin. And Father said his heart was quiet then, too, even though he knew what they would be saying in every cabin about the land by nightfall, just as he had known what they were saying during the last 4 or 5 months, while his granddaughter's condition, which he had never tried to conceal, could no longer be mistaken.
"Wash Jones has fixed old Sutpin at last. It's taken him 20 years to do it, but he has got a holt of old Sutpin at last, where Sutpin will either have to tear meat or squeal."
That's what Father said he was thinking while he waited outside on the gallery where the old nigger had sent him, ordered him out, standing there maybe by the very post where the scythe had leaned rusting for 2 years, while the granddaughter's screams came steady as a clock now, but his own heart quiet, not at all concerned nor alarmed. And Father said that maybe while he stood befogged in his fumbling and groping, that morality of his that was a good deal like Sutpin's, that told him he was right in the face of all fact and usage and everything else, which had always been somehow mixed up and involved with galloping hooves, even during the old peace that nobody remembered, and in which during the 4 years of the war which he had not attended, the galloping had been only the more gallant and proud and thunderous. Father said that maybe he got his answer, that maybe there broke free and plain in mid-gallop against the yellow sky of dawn the fine, proud image of the man on the fine, proud image of the stallion, and that the fumbling and the groping broke clear and free, too, not in justification or explanation or extenuation or excuse, Father said, but as the apotheosis, lonely, explicable, beyond all human fouling. "He is bigger than all them Yankees that killed us in iron, that killed his wife and whittled his daughter and druv his son from home, that stole his niggers and ruined his land. Bigger than this whole country that he fit for, and in payment for which has brung him to keeping a little country store for his bread and meat. Bigger than the scorn and denial which he helt to his lips like the bitter cup in the book. And how could I have lived nigh to him for 20 years without being touched and changed by him? Maybe I am not as big as he is, and maybe I did not do any of the galloping, but at least I was drug along where he went, and me and him can still do hit, and will, ever so, if so be he will show me what he aims for me to do." And maybe still standing there and holding the stallion's reins after Sutpin had entered the cabin, still hearing the galloping, watching the proud galloping image merge and pass, galloping through avatars which marked the accumulation of years, time, to the fine climax where it galloped without weariness or progress, forever and forever, immortal beneath the brandished saber and the shot-torn flags, rushing down a sky in color like thunder, stood there and heard Sutpin inside the house speak his single sentence of salutation, inquiry, and farewell to the granddaughter. And Father said that for a second Wash must not have felt the very earth under his feet while he watched Sutpin emerge from the house, the riding whip in his hand, thinking quietly, like in a dream, "I can't have heard what I know I heard. I just know I can't." Thinking, "That was what got him up. It was that colt. It ain't me or mine either. It wasn't even his own that got him out of bed." Maybe feeling no earth, no stability even yet, maybe not even hearing his own voice when Sutpin saw his face, the face of the man who in 20 years he had no more known to make any move save at command than he had the stallion which he rode, and stopped. "You said if she was a mare, you could give her a decent stall in the stable." Maybe not even hearing Sutpen when he said, sudden and sharp, "Stand back! Don't you touch me!" Only he must have heard that, because he answered it, "I'm going to touch you, Colonel." And Sutpen said, "Stand back, Wash," again, before the old woman heard the whip. Only there were 2 blows with the whip. They found the 2 welts on Wash's face that night. Maybe the 2 blows even knocked him down. Maybe it was while he was getting up that he put his hand on the thighs. "Wait!" Shreve said. "For Christ's sake, wait! You mean that he—" Sat there all that day in the little window where he could watch the road, probably laid the scythe down and went straight into the house, where maybe the granddaughter on the pallet asked querulously what it was, and he answered, "What? What racket, honey?" And maybe he tried to persuade her to eat, too. The side meat he had probably brought home from the store Saturday night, or maybe the candy, trying to tempt her with it, maybe. The nickel's worth of stale, jellified glue out of a striped sack. And maybe ate himself, and then sat at the window where he could look out above the body and the scythe and the weeds below and watch the road, because he was sitting there when the half-grown boy came around the corner of the house whistling and saw him. And Father said he must have realized then that it would not be much after dark when it would happen, that he must have sat there and felt them gathering with the horses and dogs and guns, the curious and the vengeful, men of Sutpen's own kind, who used to eat at his table with him back when he, Wash, had yet to approach nearer the house than the Scuppernong arbor, men who had led the way, shown the other and lesser ones how to fight in battle, who might also possess signed papers from the generals saying they were among the first and foremost of the brave, who had galloped also in the old days, arrogant and proud, on the fine horses, about the fine plantations, symbol also of admiration and hope, instruments, too, of despair and grief. These it was whom he was expected to run from, and it seeming to him probably that he had no less to run from than he had to run to, that if he ran, he would be fleeing merely one set of bragging and evil shadows for another, since they, men, were all of a kind throughout all of earth, which he knew. And he old, too old to run far, even if he were to run who could never escape them, no matter how much or how far he ran. A man past 60 could not expect to run that far, far enough to escape beyond the boundaries of earth where such men lived, set the order and the rule of living. And Father said that maybe for the first time in his life he began to comprehend how it had been possible for Yankees or any other army to have whipped them, the gallant, the proud, the brave, the acknowledged and chosen best among them all to bear the courage and honor and pride. It would probably be about sunset now, and probably he could feel them quite near now. Father said it probably seemed to him that he could even hear them. All the voices, the murmuring of tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow beyond the immediate fury. Old Wash Jones come a tumble at last. He thought he had Sutpen, but Sutpen fooled him. He thought he had him, but old Wash Jones got fooled. And then, maybe even saying it aloud, shouting it, Father said, "But I never expected that, Colonel. You know I never." Until maybe the granddaughter stirred and spoke querulously again, and he went and quieted her and returned to talk to himself again, but careful now, quiet now, since Sutpen was close enough to hear him easy without shouting. You know I never expected or asked or wanted nothing from e'er living man but what I expected from you. And I never asked that. I didn't think it would need. I just said to myself, I don't need to. What need has a fellow like Wash Jones to question or doubt the man that General Lee himself said in a hand-wrote ticket that he was brave? Brave! And maybe it would be loud again, forgetting again. Brave! Better if ne'er one of them had ever rid back in 65 thinking. Better if his kind and mine, too, had never drawn the breath of life on this earth. Better that all who remain of us be blasted from the face of it than that another Wash Jones
should see his whole life shredded from him and shriveled away like a dried shuck thrown on to the fire.
Then they rode up. He must have been listening to them as they came down the road, the dogs and the horses, and seen the lanterns, since it was dark now, and Major Despain, who was sheriff then, got down and saw the body, though he said he did not see Wash, nor know that he was there until Wash spoke his name quietly from the window, almost in his face. "That's you, Major?" Despain told him to come on out, and he said how Wash's voice was quite quiet when he said he would be out in just a minute. It was too quiet, too calm, so much too quiet and calm that Despain said he did not realize for a moment that it was too calm and quiet. "In just a minute, soon as I see about my granddaughter." "We'll see to her," Despain said. "You come on out." "Sure, Major," Wash said. "In just a minute." So they waited in front of the dark house, and the next day Father said there were 100 that remembered about the butcher knife that he kept hidden and razor sharp, the one thing in his sloven life that he was ever known to take pride in or care of, only by the time they remembered all this it was too late. So they didn't know what he was about. They just heard him moving inside the dark house. Then they heard the granddaughter's voice, fretful and querulous. "Who is it? Light the lamp, Grandpa." Then his voice. "It won't need no light, honey. It won't take but a minute." Then Despain drew his pistol and said, "You, Wash, come out of there!" And still Wash didn't answer, murmuring still to the granddaughter, "Where air ye?" And the fretful voice answering, "Right here. Where else would I be? What is—" Then Despain said, "Jones!" And he was already fumbling at the broken steps when the granddaughter screamed. And now all the men there claimed that they heard the knife on both the neck bones, though Despain didn't. He just said he knew that Wash had come out onto the gallery, and that he sprang back before he found out that it was not toward him Wash was running, but toward the end of the gallery where the body lay. But that he did not think about the size. He just ran backward a few feet when he saw Wash stoop and rise again, and now Wash was running toward him. Only he was running toward them all, Despain said, running into the lanterns so that now they could see the scythe raised above his head. They could see his face, his eyes, too, as he ran with the scythe above his head, straight into the lanterns and the gun barrels, making no sound, no outcry, while Despain ran backward before him, saying, "Jones, stop! Stop, or I'll kill you! Jones! Jones! Jones!" "Wait," Shreve said. "You mean that he got the son he wanted, after all that trouble, and then turned right around and—" "Yes." Sitting in Grandfather's office that afternoon with his head kind of flung back a little, explaining it to Grandfather, like he might have been explaining arithmetic to Henry back in the 4th grade. "You see, all I wanted was just a son, which seems to me, when I look about at my contemporary scene, no exorbitant gift from nature or circumstance to demand." "Will you wait?" Shreve said. "That with the son he went to all that trouble to get lying right there behind him in the cabin, he would have to taunt the grandfather into killing first him and then the child, too?" "What?" Quentin said. "It wasn't a son. It was a girl." "Oh," Shreve said. "Come on. Let's get out of this damn icebox and go to bed." Chapter 8. There would be no deep breathing tonight. The window would remain closed above the frozen and empty quad, beyond which the windows in the opposite wall were, with 2 or 3 exceptions, already dark. Soon the chimes would ring for midnight, the notes melodious and tranquil, faint and clear as glass in the fierce, it had quit snowing, still air. "So the old man sent the nigger for Henry," Shreve said. "And Henry came in, and the old man said, 'They cannot marry because he is your brother.' And Henry said, 'You lie,' like that quick, no space, no interval, no nothing between, like when you press the button and get light in the room. And the old man just sat there, didn't even move and strike him, and so Henry didn't say, "You lie again," because he knew now it was so. He just said, "It's not true." Not, "I don't believe it," but "It's not true," because he could maybe see the old man's face again now, and demon or no, it was a kind of grief and pity, not for himself, but for Henry, because Henry was just young, while he, the old man, knew that he still had the courage, and even all the shrewdness, too. Shreve stood beside the table, facing Quentin again, though not seated now. In the overcoat buttoned awry over the bathrobe, he looked huge and shapeless, like a disheveled bear, as he stared at Quentin, the Southerner, whose blood ran quick to cool, more supple to compensate for violent changes of temperature, perhaps merely nearer the surface, who sat hunched in his chair, his hands thrust into his pockets, as if he were trying to hug himself warm between his arms, looking somehow fragile and even wan in the lamplight, the rosy glow which now had nothing of warmth, coziness in it, while both their breathing vaporized faintly in the cold room where there was now not two of them, but four, the two who breathed, not individuals now, yet something both more and less than twins, the heart and blood of youth. Shreve was 19, a few months younger than Quentin. He looked exactly 19. He was one of those people whose correct age you never know because they look exactly that, and so you tell yourself that he or she cannot possibly be that because he or she looks too exactly that, not to take advantage of the appearance. So you never believe implicitly that he or she is either that age which they claim or that which in sheer desperation they agree to, or which someone else reports them to be. Strong enough and willing enough for 2,000, for all. Not two of them in a New England college sitting room, but one in a Mississippi library 60 years ago, with holly and mistletoe in vases on the mantel, or thrust behind, crowning and garlanding with the season and time the pictures on the walls, and a sprig or so decorating the photograph, the group, mother and two children, on the desk behind which the father sat when the son entered. And they, Quentin and Shreve, thinking how after the father spoke and before what he said stopped being shock and began to make sense, the son would recall later how he had seen through the window beyond his father's head the sister and the lover in the garden, pacing slowly, the sister's head bent with listening, the lover's head leaned above it while they paced slowly on in that rhythm which not the eyes but the heart marks and calls the beat and measure for, to disappear slowly beyond some bush or shrub starred with white bloom, jasmine, spirea, honeysuckle, perhaps myriad scentless, unpickable Cherokee roses, names, blooms which Shreve possibly had never heard and never seen, although the air had blown over him first, which became tempered to nourish them. And it would not matter here that the time had been winter in that garden too, and hence no bloom nor leaf, even if there had been someone to walk there and be seen there, since, judged by subsequent events, it had been night in the garden also. But that did not matter, because it had been so long ago. It did not matter to them, Quentin and Shreve, anyway, who could, without moving, as free now of flesh as the father who decreed and forbade, the son who denied and repudiated, the lover who acquiesced, the beloved who was not bereaved, and with no tedious transition from hearth and garden, granted the garden, to saddle, be already clattering over the frozen ruts of that December night and that Christmas dawn, that day of peace and cheer, of holly and goodwill and logs on the hearth. Not two of them there and then, either, but four of them, riding the two horses through the iron darkness, and that not mattering either, what faces and what names they called themselves and were called by, so long as the blood coursed. The blood, the immortal, brief, recent, intransient blood, which could hold honor above slothy unregret, and love above fat and easy shame. And Ban didn't know it, Shreve said,
The old man didn't move, and this time Henry didn't say, "You lie." He said, "It's not true." And the old man said, "Ask him. Ask Charles, then." And then Henry knew that that was what his father had meant all the time, and that that was what he meant himself when he told his father he lied. Because what the old man said wasn't just, "He is your brother," but, "He has known all the time that he is yours and your sister's brother." But Bond didn't. Listen, don't you remember how your father said it, about how not one time did he, the old guy, the demon, ever seem to wonder either how the other wife managed to find him, track him down, had never once seemed to wonder what she might have been doing all that time, how she might have passed that time, the 30 years since that day when he paid his bill with her and got it receipted, so he thought, and saw with his own eyes that it was, so he thought, destroyed, torn up and thrown to the wind, never once wondered about this, but only that she had done it, had tracked him down, could have and would have wanted to. So it wasn't her that told Bond. She wouldn't have. Maybe for the reason that she knew he, the demon, would believe she had. Or maybe she didn't get around to telling him. Maybe she just never thought that there could be anyone as close to her as a lone child out of her own body who would have to be told how she had been scorned and suffered. Or maybe she was already telling it before he was big enough to know words. And so, by the time he was big enough to understand what was being told him, she had told it so much and so hard that the words didn't make sense to her anymore either, because they didn't have to make sense to her. And so she had got to the point where, when she thought she was saying it, she was quiet. And when she thought she was quiet, it was just the hate and the fury and the unsleeping and the unforgetting. Or maybe she didn't intend for him to know it then. Maybe she was grooming him for that hour and moment which she couldn't foresee, but that she knew would arrive someday because it would have to arrive, or else she would have to do like the Aunt Rosa and deny that she had ever breathed. The moment when he would stand side by side, not face to face with his father, where fate or luck or justice or whatever she called it could do the rest. And it did, better than she could have invented or hoped or even dreamed. And your father said how, being a woman, she probably wasn't even surprised. Grooming him herself, bringing him on by hand herself, washing and feeding and putting him to bed and giving him the candy and the toys and the other child's fun and diversion and needs in measured doses like medicine with her own hands. Not because she had to, who could have hired a dozen or bought 100 to do it for her with the money. The jack that he, the demon, had voluntarily surrendered, repudiated to balance his moral ledger. But like the millionaire, who could have 100 hustlers and handlers, but who has just the one horse, the one maiden, the one moment, the one matching of heart and muscle and will with the one instant, and himself, the millionaire, patient in the overalls and the sweat and the stable muck, bringing him along to the moment when she would say, "He is your father. He cast you and me aside and denied you his name. Now go." And then sit down and let God finish it. Pistol or knife or rack, destruction or grief or anguish, God to call the shot or turn the wheel. Jesus, you can almost see him. A little boy already come to learn, to expect, before he could remember having learned his own name or the name of the town where he lived, or how to say either of them. That every so often he would be snatched up from playing and held, gripped between the two hands, fierce with what passed at least with him for it, love, against the two fierce rigid knees, the faith that he remembered since before remembering began, as supervising all the animal joys of palate and stomach and entrails, of warmth and pleasure and security, swooping down at him in a kind of blazing immobility, he taking the interruption as a matter of course, as just another natural phenomenon of existence, the face filled with furious and almost unbearable unforgiving, almost like fever, not bitterness and despair, just implacable will for revenge, as just another manifestation of mammalian love, and he not knowing what in hell it was all about, who would be too young to curry any connected fact out of the fury and hate and the tumbling speed, not comprehending or caring, just curious, creating for himself without help, since who to help him, his own notion of that Puerto Rico or Haiti or wherever it was he understood vaguely that he had come from, like Orthodox children do of heaven or the cabbage patch or wherever it was that they came from. Except that his was different, in that you were not supposed, your mother didn't intend to anyway, to ever go back there. And maybe, when you got as old as she was, you would be horrified, too, every time you found hidden in your thoughts anything that just smelled or tasted like it might be a wish to go back there, which you were not supposed to know when and why you left, but only that you had escaped. That whatever power had created the place for you to hate it had likewise got you away from the place, so you could hate it good, and never forgive it in quiet and monotony, though not exactly in what you would call peace. That you were to thank God you didn't remember anything about it, yet at the same time you were not to, maybe dared not to, ever forget it. He not even knowing, maybe, that he took it for granted that all kids didn't have fathers, too, and that getting snatched every day or so from whatever harmless pursuit in which you were not bothering anybody, or even thinking about them, by someone, because that someone was bigger than you, stronger than you, and being held for a minute or 5 minutes under a kind of busted water pipe of incomprehensible fury and fierce yearning and vindictiveness and jealous rage, was a part of childhood which all mothers of children had received in turn from their mothers, and from their mothers in turn from that Puerto Rico or Haiti or wherever it was we all came from, but none of us ever lived in, so that when he grew up and had children, he would have to pass it on too, and maybe deciding then and there that it was too much trouble and bother, and that he would not have any children, or at least hoped he would not, and hence no man had a father, no one personal Puerto Rico or Haiti, but all mother faces which ever bred, swooping down at those almost calculable moments out of some obscure ancient general affronting and outraging which the actual living articulate meat had not even suffered, but merely inherited. All boy flesh that walked and breathed, stemming from that one ambiguous, eluded, dark fatherhead, and so brothered, perennial, and ubiquitous everywhere under the sun. They stared at one another, glared rather, their quiet, regular breathing vaporizing faintly and steadily in the now tomb-like air. There was something curious in the way they looked at one another, curious and quiet and profoundly intent. Not at all as two young men might look at each other, but almost as a youth and a very young girl might out of virginity itself, a sort of hushed and naked searching. Then he got older, and got out from under the apron, despite her, him too maybe the both of them, and he didn't even care. He found out that she was up to something, and he not only didn't care, he didn't even care that he didn't know what it was. Got older and found out that she had been shaping and tempering him to be the instrument for whatever it was her hand was implacable for, maybe came to believe or saw that she had tricked him into receiving that shape and temper, and didn't care about that too, because probably by that time he had learned that there were 3 things and no more: breathing, pleasure, darkness. And without money there could be no pleasure, and without pleasure it would not even be breathing, but mere protoplasmic inhale and collapse of blind unorganism in a darkness where light never began. And he had the money because he knew that she knew that the money was the only thing she could coerce and smooth him into the barrier with when Derby Day came, so she didn't dare pinch him there, and she knew he knew it, so that maybe he even blackmailed her. Bought her off that way. You give me the jack as I want it, and I won't ask why or what for yet. Or maybe she was so busy grooming him that she never thought of the money now, who probably never had had much time to remember it or count it or wonder how much there was in the intervals of the hating and the being mad. And so all to check him up about the money would be the lawyer, and he, Barn, probably learned that the first thing, that he could go to his mother and hold the lawyer's feet to the fire any time, like the millionaire horse has only to come in one time with a little extra sweat on him, and tomorrow he will have a new jock. Sure, that's who it would be. The lawyer. That lawyer with his private mad female millionaire to farm.
who probably wasn't interested enough in the money to see whether the checks had any other writing on them when she signed them. That lawyer who, with Bond's mother already plotting and planning him since before he could remember, and even if she didn't know it, or whether she knew it or not, or would have cared or not, for that day when he should be translated quick into so much rich and rotting dirt, had already been plowing and planting and harvesting him and the mother both, as if he already was. That lawyer, who maybe had the secret drawer in the secret safe and the secret paper in it, maybe a chart with colored pins stuck into it like generals have in campaigns, and all the notations in code. Today he finished robbing a drunken Indian of 100 miles of virgin land, value $25,000. At 2:31 today, came up out of swamp with final plank for house, value in conjunction with land, $40,000. 7:52 p.m. Today married. Bigamy threat, value -0 unless quick buyer, not probable. Doubtless conjoined with wife same day, say 1 year, and then maybe the date and the hour too. Son, intrinsic value, possible though not probable forced sale of house and land, plus value crop minus child's 1/4. Emotional value plus 100% times 0, plus value crop. Say 10 years, 1 or more children, intrinsic value, forced sale house and improved land, plus liquid assets, minus children's share. Emotional value, 100% times increase yearly for each child, plus intrinsic value, plus liquid assets, plus working acquired credit, and maybe here with the date too, daughter. And you could maybe even have seen the question mark after it, and the other words even. Daughter, 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 trailing off not because thinking trailed off, but on the contrary, thinking stopping right still then, backing up a little and spreading like when you lay a stick across a trickle of water, spreading and rising slow all around him in whatever place it was that he could lock the door to and sit quiet and subtract the money that Bond was spending on his whores and his champagne from what his mother had, and figure up how much would be left of it tomorrow and next month and next year, or until Sutton would be good and ripe, thinking about the good hard cash that Bond was throwing away on his horses and clothes and the champagne and gambling and women. He would have known about the octoroon and the left-handed marriage long before the mother did, even if it had been any secret. Maybe he even had a spy in the bedroom, like he seems to have had in Sutton's. Maybe he even planted her. Said to himself, like you do about a dog, he is beginning to ramble. He needs a block, not a tether, just a light block of some sort, so he can't get inside of anything that might have a fence around it. And only him to try to check it, or as much as he dared, and not getting far because he knew, too, that all Bond had to do was to go to his mother, and the racehorse would have a gold eating trough if he wanted it. And if the jock wasn't careful, a new jockey, too. Counting up the money, figuring what he would net at this normal rate over the next few years, against what it looked like would be left of it to net from by that time, and meanwhile crucified between his two problems, whether maybe what he ought to do was to wash his hands of the Sutpin angle and clean up what was left and light out for Texas. Except whenever he thought about doing that, he would have to think about all the money that Bond had already spent, and that if he had only gone to Texas 10 years ago, or 5 years ago, or even last year, so that maybe at night, while he would be waiting for the window to begin to turn gray, he would be like the Aunt Rosa said she was, and he would have to deny that he breathed, or maybe wished he didn't, except for that 200% times the intrinsic value every New Year's, the water backing up from the stick and rising and spreading about him steadily and quiet as light, and him sitting there in the actual white glare of clairvoyance, or second sight, or faith in human misfortune and folly, or whatever you want to call it, that was showing him not only what might happen, but what was actually going to happen, and him declining to believe it was going to happen, not because it had come to him as a vision, but because it would have to have love and honor and courage and pride in it, and believing it might happen, not because it was logical and possible, but because it would be the most unfortunate thing for all concerned that could occur. And though you could no more have proved vice or virtue or courage or cowardice to him without showing him the moving people, than you could have proved death to him without showing him a corpse. He did believe in misfortune because of that rigorous and arduous dusty eunuch's training, which taught to leave man's good luck and joys to God, who would, in return, surrender all his miseries and follies and misfortunes to the lice and fleas of Coke and Littleton. And the old Sabine— They stared, glared at one another, their voices— It was Shreve speaking, though save for the slight difference which the intervening degrees of latitude had inculcated in them, differences not in tone or pitch, but of turns of phrase and usage of words, it might have been either of them, and was, in a sense, both thinking as one, the voice which happened to be speaking the thought, only the thinking become audible, vocal, the two of them creating between them, out of the ragtag and bob-ends of old tales and talking, people who perhaps had never existed at all anywhere, who shadows were shadows not of flesh and blood, which had lived and died, but shadows in turn of what were, to one of them at least, to Shreve, shades too, quiet as the visible murmur of their vaporizing breath. The chimes now began to ring for midnight, melodious, slow, and faint beyond the closed, the snow-sealed window. The old Sabine, who couldn't to save her life have told you or the lawyer or Barn or anybody else probably what she wanted, expected, hoped for, because she was a woman and didn't need to want or hope or expect anything, but just to want and expect and hope. And besides, your father said that when you have plenty of good, strong hating, you don't need hope, because the hating will be enough to nourish you. The old Sabine, not so old yet, but she would have just let herself go in the sense that you keep the engines clean and oiled and the best of coal in the bunkers, but you don't bother to shine the bright work or holystone the decks any more. Just let herself go on the outside. Not fat. She would burn it up too fast for that. Shrivel it away in the gullet between swallowing and stomach. No pleasure in the chewing, having to chew just another nuisance, like no pleasure in the clothing. Having the old wear out and having to choose the new, just another nuisance, and no pleasure in the fine figure he— neither of them said Barn— cut in the fine pants that fit his leg, and the fine coats that fit his shoulders, nor in the fact that he had more watches and cuff buttons and finer linen and horses and yellow-wheeled buggies, not to mention the gals, than most others did, but all that, too, just an unavoidable nuisance that he would have to get shut of before he could do her any good, just like he had to get shut of the teething and the chicken pox and the light boy's bones in order to be able to do her any good. The old Sabine getting the faked reports from the lawyer like reports sent back to headquarters from a battlefront, with maybe a special nigger in the lawyer's anteroom to do nothing else but carry them, and that maybe once in 2 years or 5 times in 2 days, depending on when she would begin to itch for news and began to worry him. The report, the communique about how we are not far behind him in Texas or Missouri or maybe California. California would be fine, that far away, convenient, proof inherent in the sheer distance, the necessity to accept and believe. And we are going to catch up with him any day now, and so do not worry. So she wouldn't. She wouldn't worry at all. She would just have out the carriage and go to the lawyer, busting in the black dress that looked like a section of limp stovepipe, and maybe not even a hat, but just a shawl over her head, so that the only things missing would be the mop and the pail, busting in and saying, "He's dead. I know he is dead. And how can he be?" Not meaning what the Aunt Rosa meant. Where did they find or invent a bullet that could kill him? But how can he be allowed to die without having to admit that he was wrong and suffer and regret it? And so, in the next 2 seconds, they would almost catch him. He, the lawyer, would show her the actual letter, the writing in the English she couldn't read, that had just come in, that he had just sent for the nigger to carry to her when she came in,
And the lawyer done practiced putting the necessary date on the letter until he could do it now while his back would be toward her, in the 2 seconds it would take him to get the letter out of the file, catch him, get so close to him as to have ample satisfaction that he was alive, so close indeed that he would be able to get her out of the office before she had sat down, and into the carriage again, and on the way home again, where, among the Florentine mirrors and Paris drapes and tuft camisoles, she would still look like the one that had come in to scrub the floors, in the black dress that the cook wouldn't have looked at even when it was new 5 or 6 years ago, holding, clutching the letter she couldn't read, maybe the only word in it she could even recognize would be the word Sutton, in one hand, and brushing back a rope of lank iron-colored hair with the other, and not looking at the letter like she was reading it, even if she could have, but swooping at it, blazing down at it as if she knew she would have only a second to read it in, only a second for it to remain intact in after her eyes would touch it, before it took fire, and so would not be perused but consumed, leaving her sitting there with a black, crumbling, blank carbon ash in her hand, and him, neither of them said Barn, there watching her, who had got old enough to have learned that what he thought was childhood wasn't childhood, that other children had been made by fathers and mothers, where he had been created new when he began to remember, new again when he came to the point where his carcass quit being a baby and became a boy, new again when he quit being a boy and became a man, between a woman whom he had thought was feeding and washing and putting him to bed, and finding him in the extra ticklings for his palate and his pleasure, because he was himself, until he got big enough to find out that it wasn't him at all she was washing and feeding the candy, and the fun too, but it was a man that hadn't even arrived yet, whom even she had never seen yet, who would be something else beside that boy when he did arrive, like the dynamite which destroys the house and the family, and maybe even the whole community, ain't the old peaceful paper that maybe would rather be blowing aimless and light along the wind, or the old merry sawdust, or the old quiet chemicals that had rather be still and dark in the quiet earth, like they had been before the meddling guy with 10-power spectacles came and dug them up and strained, warped, and kneaded them, created between this woman and a hired lawyer, the woman who, since before he could remember, he now realized had been planning and grooming him for some moment that would come and pass, and following which he saw that, to her, he would be little more than so much rich, rotting dirt. The lawyer who, since before he could remember, he now realized, had been plowing and planting and watering and manuring and harvesting him as if he already was. Him watching her, lounging there against the mantel, maybe in the fine clothes, in the harem incense odor of what you might call easy sanctity, watching her looking at the letter, not even thinking, I am looking upon my mother naked, since if the hating was nakedness, she had worn it long enough now for it to do the office of clothing, like they say that modesty can do, does. So he went away. He went away to school at the age of 28, and he wouldn't know nor care about that either. Which of them, mother or lawyer, it was who decided he should go to school, nor why, because he had known all the time that his mother was up to something and that the lawyer was up to something, and he didn't care enough about what either of them was to try to find out. Who knew that the lawyer knew that his mother was up to something, but that his mother didn't know that the lawyer was up to something, and that it would be all right with the lawyer if his mother got whatever it was she wanted, provided he, the lawyer, got what he wanted 1 second before, or at least at the same time. He went away to school, he said, all right, and told the octoroon goodbye and went to school, who not in all the 28 years had ever been told by anyone, do as these others do. Have this task done at 9 a.m. tomorrow, or Friday, or Monday. Maybe it was even the octoroon whom they, or the lawyer, used. The light block, not tether, which the lawyer had put on him to keep him from getting inside of something which might be found to have a fence around it later.
Maybe the mother found out about the octoroon and the child and the ceremony and discovered more than the lawyer had, or would believe, who considered Bon only dull, not a fool, and sent for him, and he came and lounged against the mantel again, and maybe knowing what was up, what had happened before she told him, lounging there with an expression on his face you might call smiling, except that it was not that, but just something you couldn't see through or past, and she watching him with maybe the lank, iron-colored strand of hair down again, and not even bothering to brush it back now, because she was not looking at any letter now, but her eyes blazing at him, her voice trying to blaze at him out of the urgency of alarm and fear, but she managing to keep it down, since she could not talk about betrayal because she had not told him yet, and now, at this moment, she would not dare risk it. He looking at her from behind the smiling that wasn't smiling, but was just something you were not supposed to see beyond, saying, admitting it, "Why not? All young men do it. The ceremony, too. I didn't set out to get the child, but now that I have, it's not a bad child, either." And she watching him, glaring at him, and not being able to say what she would because she had put off too long now saying what she could. "But you, this is different." And she would not need to say it. He would know because he already knew why she had sent for him, even if he did not know and did not care what she had been up to since before he could remember, since before he could take a woman whether in love or not. Why not? Men seem to have to marry some day, sooner or later. And this is one whom I know, who makes me no trouble. And with the ceremony, that bother already done, and as for a little matter like a spot of Negro blood, not needing to talk much, say much either, not needing to say, "I seem to have been born into this world with so few fathers that I have too many brothers to outrage and shame while alive, and hence too many descendants to bequeath my little portion of hurt and harm to, dead." Not that, just a little spot of Negro blood. And then to watch the face, the desperate urgency and fear, then to depart, kissing her maybe, her hand maybe which would lie in his and even touch his lips like a dead hand, because of the desperate casting for this straw or that. Maybe, as he went out, he said, "She will go to him," the lawyer. "If I were to wait 5 minutes, I could see her in the shawl. So probably by tonight I will be able to know, if I cared to know." Maybe by night he did, maybe before that if they managed to find him, get word to him, because she went to the lawyer, and it was right in the lawyer's alley. Maybe before she even got started telling it good, that gentle white glow began, like when you turn up a wick. Maybe he could even almost see his hand writing on into the space where the daughter never had quite showed. Because maybe that had been the lawyer's trouble and worry and concern all the time, that ever since she had made him promise he would never tell Bon who his father was, he had been waiting and wondering how to do it, since maybe he knew that if he were to tell Bon, Bon might believe it or he might not, but certainly he would go and tell his mother that the lawyer had told him, and then he, the lawyer, would be sunk, not for any harm done, because there would be no harm, since this could not alter the situation, but for having crossed his paranoiac client. Maybe while he would sit in his office adding and subtracting the money and adding what they would get out of Sutton, he was never worried about what Bon would do when he found out,